Hello, everyone, then, and welcome to this webinar and this interview today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and Info Voices, which is a local group, and this is one of the many webinars we do. But what we're doing today is sort of interesting. We're not doing a normal interview of someone involved in community action. We're interviewing Tony Koutsoumbos, who is passionate about debate and has been for a long time. And debate is really, really an important skill. And it's something that all of us can learn. And it helps us formulate our arguments in a better and more cohesive way. And it helps us in our attempts at public discourse. So Tony's going to talk to us about that because it is an important thing to do, especially in the age of fake news and social networks where we don't get rational debate. So Tony, thank you for joining us today and for taking part in this. And if I can ask you, without you going into too much detail, because we've got lots of questions, if you could start by telling us a little bit about your own background.
Yes, thank you, Francis, for having me today, and welcome to all of you who are here in the meeting and everyone else watching as well. So a little bit about my background. Well, those who may be meeting me for the first time here may have seen me pop up occasionally as the director of an organisation called the Great Debaters Club, which is what I've been doing for the last 4 years. But going back a little bit further to where my background actually starts and where my interest in debate really starts and how it led me to what I've been doing for the last 4 years professionally, but for the last 10 years or more as a hobby and a passion. It really starts back when I was a teenager. I was the son of a lawyer and a teacher, which I suppose therefore makes it kind of sensible that I'm going to become a debate trainer later. And I suppose where my story started in terms of my interest in debate was the moment I became really poignantly aware for the first time of how there are at least two sides to every story. And I think I owe that partly to my dual ethnicity, being English and Greek, as well as to generally being encouraged to debate at home, at the dinner table. But the specific moment that I often think back to was during the Kosovo War in 1999. And in that time, most of the media coverage that I'd been watching and seeing was purely here in the UK, which focused very much on the dominant narrative of that conflict here in the UK. And then I went to Greece to see my family for Easter, the height of the conflict, and saw the story saw that conflict rather being presented in a very, very different way, with a very different narrative by the Greek media. So whereas the English media here would focus more on the situation in Kosovo itself, it would focus on the ethnic cleansing of Albanians. In Greece, the coverage would focus much more on the bombardment of Belgrade and on the civilian casualties there of the bombing campaign.
Can I ask you then, because I mean that's quite interesting that's sort of where your passion started when you saw what happened in Kosovo. But what is debate then? Is it the ability to both see and practice two sides of an argument?
Sure. So the reason I started there, the reason I was going to take that is because precisely when you are, let me put it this way, debate is about accepting that any kind of decision you will ever make where it's not obvious what to do and there's more than one option, there's more than one viewpoint. It is the acceptance that any decision you make will carry a cost that will need to be justified. However strongly you feel about whatever it is that you are doing. And the reason I went back to that moment is that that was the first time I became really aware of that. And that's very much guided the way I look at any kind of, not just current affairs, but also generally how I look at decisions that I have to make in my own life, my own professional life as well from that point on. However right you think you are, you still need to accept that whatever you want to do will carry a cost. And that cost will need to be justified, especially if you're having to work with other people who feel very strongly about an alternative course of action in order to make a decision that both of you can accept. And it's that part, that's what debate is. Working with someone to make a decision that everyone can accept, even if it means making a choice that runs very much counter to what another group of people really want to do or really believe.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you came to debate that way. I mean, many people come to debate, such as in the Oxford Union and so on, because they think it's fun. They're a student, it's great, but you see it as having a real practical use in actually seeing two sides of an argument. When you look at the House of Commons now and council chambers, do you ever get despondent that the real skills of debate and the real purpose of debate is lost and it's sort of diluted there? It's not what you think it should be.
I think that's a fair observation to make. I would be very reticent to try and judge all MPs and try and apply a blanket judgment to all MPs, because there are some who are many in fact who are extraordinarily conscientious about their duty as members of Parliament, and incredibly committed not just to defending their own point of view with evidence, but also working with people on the other side of the aisle in order to reach a conclusion that everyone can accept. But having watched debates in Parliament and gone to the gallery and taken groups there, delegations there to watch debates, I've certainly seen examples of arguments being made in a way that I would call up as being less than constructive if they were used in a debate that I was hosting.
And of course, we're in the age of social networks now, and you must feel sometimes that the skills of debate are totally lost, because you get people who want to be in echo chambers, you get a lot of abuse. You get people who come on social networks who cannot see the other side of an argument. Does that make it, in your view, that the skills of debate are more necessary than ever now?
Obviously, my answer to that's going to be yes, but I think that answer probably wouldn't be helpful without really going back into what we actually mean by debates, because certainly if I use that word without any kind of context, then to a lot of people who don't have the grounding, the experience and the passion for it that I have, then will quite understandably define it more by just what they see on the surface happening, which is two people disagreeing with each other, butting heads, and deliberately disagreeing with each other. And especially when disagreement is something that we generally shy away from and see as being an obstacle to working together rather than a crucial part of working together, that must seem really, really strange to people. So I think rather than use the word debate there, I think really what we have to reclaim in the first place is the importance of encouraging and embracing disagreement and seeing it as a virtue. But like all virtues, it really depends on how it's done. Just in the same way that we are all participants in a democracy, one of the oldest democracies in the world, and yet we only have to look around the globe to see that there are examples of democracy being done well and democracy being done badly. Just being a democracy doesn't automatically mean you're going to enrich the lives of your population. And the same goes when you are in a debate. If you are not approaching a debate with the purpose in mind for which it was designed, which is to reach a decision that everyone can accept and see as fair and legitimate, even if some of them disagree with the outcome. And if you approach it instead as just with the intention to just beat the opponent into submission, then you are going to end up having a poorer quality of debate and exacerbating some of these problems and driving people even further away from wanting to improve their debate skills.
So a lot of people that go into debates go into it because they love the fun of it, and just want to get in. They want to make their speech. They want the theatre of it. But you have a mission. You have a mission which says debate is useful. You're not there to debate. You're there to tell people how debate can be useful. So you do a lot of work, don't you, with other organisations and with schools to spread that mission.
I've done a bit of work with schools. The work I've done with schools has mainly been on a voluntary basis, because the schools I've worked with have traditionally been state schools or further education colleges, where the budget wouldn't be available for a formal debate training scheme. So I would go in there as a volunteer, and certainly there are obstacles to getting the most out of debate training in those environments that go way beyond just debate training not being available or affordable, and that could be the subject of an entirely different webinar. But more broadly, what that's been part of, especially when combined with what I have been doing for a living of running Great Debates Club and hosting free public debates twice a month for best part of 10 years now, is making debating accessible to people who would have been put off by its image or being something of an elitist sport, rather than an invaluable life skill that we all need and that we all use every day.
So you also, don't you, you actually set up workshops as well, training workshops to help people develop the skills that you're talking about now.
That came later, yes. So started off just running as a hobby horse, really running public debates, people to come along to. When I first started that, it was initially just for people like me who had left university, where I did a lot of debating, where I found it really useful in all areas of my life, and then found myself as a graduate with nowhere to go to continue debating. So I set up my own club. And when I saw people coming along to that, not those who had debated before university or school, but rather those who had never done it because they'd been put off by this elitist reputation it has, coming along and getting a lot out of it, eventually those people started asking for training as well in order to feel more confident doing it, so they could participate more and learn how to apply it in their lives more broadly. And that's when the training workshops started. And the debates then served a slightly different purpose, as well as being open, free debates for anyone in the community to come along and take part in. It was also an opportunity for people who'd gone through our training program to test their skills that they were developing in a live environment, but also a safe space where they could experiment with these skills, experiment with attempts to engage with different points of view, defend points of view other than their own, without having to face the adverse consequences they might experience if they tried doing that from a standing start in the workplace, for example.
Okay, well, let's look at a couple of arguments that people have that show they have reservations about debate. Sounds like we'll be getting into a debate, but we're not. One of them is that the trouble with debates, it is adversarial. And you may say it's about reaching an agreement, but very often it can do the second, and it can do the opposite, rather. It can make people harden their positions. And isn't there a better form of discourse, like citizens' assemblies, for example, where you try to get an agreement through a consensus rather than, bashing each other in a way? And as someone who's just typed in here today, Anne Bennett, you want meetings where they're not just a decision, but they're outcomes, and the debate format, as opposed to a consensual way of doing things, doesn't create those outcomes.
There are probably three things I'd pick out of that, because that's a really, really important question, but there are a few things that need to be unpacked. The first is that the purpose of debate isn't to reach agreement. It's to reach acceptance of a decision, even if you disagree, which, if you think about it more broadly, is the purpose of democracy. The second thing to unpack is that adversarial debating and things like citizen assemblies, of which I'm a phenomenally enthusiastic supporter, are not mutually exclusive. You can do both of them. You can use different styles of discourse for different scenarios. For example, if I was having a brainstorming session in a meeting, I wouldn't use an adversarial debate format, because I wouldn't want people to feel like they were being pigeonholed to commit to a certain position and defend it. I just want people to speak their minds, think freely without having to commit themselves to a point of view, because we weren't trying to reach a decision. But let's say that we're going to a point where we have to decide, we have to make a decision right now. Are we going to hire someone or fire someone? Are we going to buy a company, sell a company? Are we going to stay in a relationship or end a relationship? These are decisions, these are binary choices. There is no middle ground between them. And it means that ultimately, whatever you decide is going to come at the expense of something else you could have done, which means it will come at a big cost. And that cost needs to be justified. And the only way you can do that is by being willing to confront head-on the points of a disagreement between the parties and say, right, we're going to talk about these, a bit like you would in a court case, for example. When you're in a courtroom, you don't have the barrister saying, let's just all get along, let's try and reach a consensus about what we want to do. You say, no, this person is either innocent or they're guilty. We need to find out which, because it's going to have a massive impact on their lives and on the lives of the person who has brought this case in the first place, who appears to have been a victim of potentially a horrendous crime. And we need to find out the truth. And that means we need to sort out and clarify exactly what it is we disagree on, the facts of the case, for example, and whether someone behaved illegally or not. And you have to be willing, therefore, to engage with different points of view rather than try and get everyone to agree, which can and often does lead to brushing points of disagreement under the carpet, which will cause you trouble later on.
Okay, and another argument that's given is that debate creates theatre and entertainment, and people love watching debates, those who like debates, because they like the cut and thrust of it. And some people will argue that's not a very good decision-making forum, because the entertainment takes over from the rationality and dilutes the whole thing. How do you respond to that?
I agree with that. I certainly agree that if people are watching the debate for the theatre itself, then yes, that's a problem. But at the same time, the theatre is also a really important part, because there is some kind of virtue in entertaining people when having a very heated disagreement. But if you think again about a barrister, or if there are any Americans in the audience, an attorney who may make their case in defense or prosecution with a real theatrical vigor. I know a lot of barristers who do have a strong interest in the arts and even do have a background in the performing arts that they continue on into their legal careers for precisely this point. And the reason is because unless you can reach your audience, it doesn't matter what the substance of your point is. If you're unable to get them to just sit down, shut up and listen to you for 5 minutes, to take an interest in what you're saying, it doesn't matter how right you are. It doesn't matter how clear-cut your reasoning is. It doesn't matter how strong your argument is. So a degree of theatre, or what I would call simply an ability to communicate, is really important, because if we just left it purely to the substance, those would be incredibly dry arguments to watch, and we might not get the theatre, but we probably wouldn't get many people watching in the first place.
Debate is interesting in many respects. One big attribute of it, and I think you sort of mentioned this, is when you look at social networks and so on, you can see that people put themselves into boxes. They believe strongly in what they believe in, and they just won't see the other side. What the skill of debate does, doesn't it, is it makes you sort of walk in someone else's shoes, see their argument, see their side. And if you can see their side, you can make it clearer what your side is as well.
I think this is perhaps the single most important facet of debate, that people who have understandable reservations about the format would probably miss sometimes, which is being a student of debate means first and foremost defending whatever position is given to you to defend. If you come from a background, which to be honest isn't really my background, but for a lot of debaters it is. If you come from a background where you took part in lots of competitions, debating competitions at university, in those competitions, you only find out what the topic is you're debating 15 minutes before you have to debate it. You only find out what side you're on then 15 minutes before you have to debate it. You only find out whether you're speaking first or speaking last 15 minutes before you debate it. And what that instills in you is a remarkable versatility to broaden your general knowledge, to be ready to talk about anything with some kind of authority and have at least some evidence to be able to present at a moment's notice. And it also requires you to familiarize yourself with arguments on all sides, not because anything particularly significant rests in it, but just because at the moment, that's what's fun for you. That's what makes it interesting. That's what will help you win. But that skill, of course, will serve you very, very well later on down the line when you're engaging with different points of view. And that's something that if you are using other formats, where purely discursive formats that will focus more on, well, you just say your point of view and I'll just say mine and we'll try and work together. That's something that you don't necessarily get. You can't really understand what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes until you've actually been stood up in public and had a go at defending their point of view as if it were your own and been judged for it.
Yeah, I mean, taking the argument of something you don't believe in is fun, but it is also transformative in a way, because it actually makes you look at other people differently. And that's useful even in a consensual discourse environment, isn't it? Because it helps you establish your argument in your position more clearly than you would have otherwise.
Absolutely, 100%. It also helps you speak to diverse audiences in their own language. So one of the most interesting projects that I was working on before the pandemic put paid to that was working with PhD researchers in the biomedical sciences and working with them to train them to have public debates on things like vaccination, and getting them to put themselves in the shoes of people who would be vaccine hesitant, and even going to the extremes of people who we commonly label as anti-vaxxers. And I use those two labels separately because not everyone who is reluctant to get a vaccination is automatically in the same league as someone who subscribes to various conspiracy theories about vaccines. But let's not get into that right now. The point is that that working with that particular cohort, what made it so interesting was that when we had a public debate at the end of our training program, there were 100 scientists in the room, which made it quite nice because it meant you were able to literally calculate what percentage of the audience was in favor or against by counting hands in the room. And before the debate started, and this debate was about whether childhood vaccination should be made mandatory. Before the debate started, 96%, so 96 out of 100 in that room were in favor of making childhood vaccination mandatory. But one of the teams had been practicing how to make an argument that had until then been very unfamiliar to them, which was the defense of personal and parental autonomy. And when they made an argument and made it in a language that they felt that other scientists like them could also understand, by the end of that debate, that number had shifted from 96 in favor to just above 50. and the room was much more evenly split, and it only took a 1 hour debate to achieve that.
So debate can be used to shift a person's viewpoint. It may not happen as much as we like, but we know it can happen. Whether it does it temporarily or whether there's a long-term shift is another question. But you said down the line it has uses as well. And one is, for example, public speaking. If you learn the skills of debate, it helps you with public speaking, doesn't it? It gives you the discipline. I remember the story where Churchill was asked to open a fete during the war when he was under pressure and busy. And he went there. They didn't expect him, but he went there and he spoke for 45 minutes. And they said to him, well, thank you for coming and for speaking for 45 minutes. And he said, well, I'm really, really sorry. I just didn't have the time to prepare a 5-minute speech. And a debate gives you all sorts of disciplines. If you're going to do public speaking, those skills, those disciplines are also transferable, aren't they?
Yes, and especially impromptu public speaking as well, or public speaking without having memorized a script beforehand. You can always tell when someone is reading from a script or reciting one from the way they speak. Their speech sounds much more wooden. It sounds like the audience is being spoken at rather than being spoken to, unless of course they're at a level, say like a TED speaker, for example, where they will have memorized speech, but they'll just be so good at speaking that it will sound like they're making it up on the spot. But that's a whole new level. But that's really important, because when you are speaking to a room, if you're going to get your audience to really engage with you, to really listen to you, to ask you questions and take something away from what they've heard, they really need to feel that you are speaking to them, not at them. And because debating is all about having to come up with something quickly to say based on the vast repository of knowledge and diversity of arguments you've been practicing for months beforehand, and then bring them to bear in that one moment that you need them, and speaking off the cuff and sounding like you're making all this stuff up, even though this is a product of months, maybe even years of practice, that allows you to go into a room with just a few notes, put them down to one side, and then speak what seems like to your audience impromptu.
So you're trying to encourage spontaneity, even though there is a lot of preparation that goes into spontaneity. Sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it isn't, is it?
Structured spontaneity, yes.
Yeah, I think that term's very good. Lots of people, though, would be really, really nervous, wouldn't they, doing debates? Standing up in front of an audience, making a case. It's a terrible ordeal for a lot of people. How would you encourage those people to have a go at debate? Or if they can't, what would you encourage them to do?
So certainly go along to meetings like the ones you're organising, for example, where you've always provided a platform for people to speak up, initially maybe just from the floor, asking a question, making a comment, which is a good start. Just to have a couple of minutes to speak, and then build up from there. There are a few public speaking clubs that I distinguish from debate clubs, where you can go along and speak. Just give your views on current affairs, and you'll be encouraged to make an argument of sorts, but you won't be required to go head to head with someone on a particular topic. I'm more than happy to recommend some if anyone wants to follow up with me about that afterwards. And then once you've had that opportunity, then joining something like a debate club, or even just getting a few people together yourself and hiring out a room and inviting people to come along and make your own debate. That's pretty much how I started. There's no reason anyone else can't do it either. And just creating for yourself that safe space in which everyone accepts in good faith that you are having a go, trying something that makes you a little bit uncomfortable, and will take that into account when it comes their turn to grill you, ask you questions, and then vote and decide how they feel about the argument you've made, and then give you positive feedback afterwards, which itself will help you build the confidence you need when it comes to using that skill in a live environment where there will be consequences for doing well or not doing as well as you would have liked.
But that's a huge step for some people. I remember a survey done decades ago, and it's probably relevant now, where they asked people what they feared the most. For me, it would be heights. I would hate it. But they found that most people feared speaking in a group. That was their number one fear. And a group wasn't big. It was like 4 or 5 people. They were afraid of it. So you telling people to go to groups and so on could be quite traumatic for some people. How do you get those people to be involved? Or is that something that's impossible to do?
Yes. So I can actually give you an example of dealing with exactly this, and I can start this by saying I completely understand how that feels. Not because I've had a fear of public speaking. As you can tell, I'm quite comfortable with it. For me, and people who know me find this quite strange actually. For me, the all-time fear is networking events, going into a room and having to go up to strangers I don't know. Well, obviously I know they're strangers, and introduce myself and start conversations. That scares the hell out of me, and I find myself literally shivering, sweating, and then heading straight for the buffet table and in those events and not talking to anyone. And maybe someone will come and talk to me, make my life a little bit easier. So I understand exactly how palpable that fear can feel. And it's quite funny that people who feel comfortable in those settings tend to be the ones who will feel really uncomfortable doing what I do and speaking in public. So we often have a good joke about that. But to your question, what can I actually do? So when the club that I ran, the Great Debates Club, when it was in its infancy, we just held debates pretty much with only a few days' notice, and we just invite speakers to volunteer, to take part. And there was no formal training program or structure or anything. And as a result, most of the speakers tended to look and sound like me. We'd have white men doing pretty much all the speaking, doing all the volunteering. It wasn't because there was a lack of diversity in the audience or a lack of interest among women or people of color in the room to speak. It was because they didn't see many people like them on the panel. And when I go up and speak to them, I found that if I would say, give a few words of encouragement, if I pick up on something that I'd heard them say in a Q&A, for example, which is a good place to start, by the way, for speaking, just go to speak up in a Q&A, 1 minute, that's it. And tell them I find it interesting, I'd like to hear more about it. And then I set a debate on that topic. I went back to them and said, you know what, I would really like you to speak in this because you had a lot to say about this. I'll give you some time. Let's perhaps we sit down and have a chat about how to do this. That dramatically increased diversity of our panels. And I've similarly found it useful if I'd gone to a networking event with someone who's really adept at how to do those things, who can almost coach me through the experience. So what I would suggest people who are going along, especially if they feel more comfortable speaking to people one-on-one and speaking in public, is perhaps mingle with some of the people in the audience, or maybe go up and speak to one of the speakers after an event and say, I feel really uncomfortable with this. What suggestions could you give me? Could perhaps we have a chat before I speak at an event like this, just so I feel a little bit comfortable, a little more comfortable, a little bit more reassured that I know what I'm doing, and that can and does make the world of difference.
Okay, well, we've sort of gone over our 30 minutes now. So last question. If people wanted to find out more about, I know you're going on to pastures new and you're not doing as much as you used to, though I'm sure you will come back into it in a big way. But if people wanted to find out more about debating skills and to be able to practice those skills, where would they go?
So as you've correctly pointed out, I'm moving on to pastures new, and the Great Debaters Club itself is no more. But we do still have our Facebook group that's been going for some time, that we've now rebranded Talking Points, and that's a group that anyone can join. So, and we are still going to be holding virtual debates and discussions as well, multiple formats too, for those who perhaps not that comfortable with adversarial debate. We use a variety of formats, and there's also a whole bunch of really interesting people in that group to meet and get to know too.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for doing that, because you've done so much for the debating world, and I think everybody appreciates that, and you articulate it incredibly well. So, you know, I think people will have learned a lot about this, a lot about debate, and discover things about debate that they never realized before. So, you know, thank you for doing it with us, Tony. And, you know, we've come to the end of our time now, so we'll finish this interview now.